So again, plagues on nature affect humanity because of what they do to our surroundings and our ability to thrive and prosper. There's also the plagues on nature, okay, because we depend on them. So I heard a great voice out of the temple saying upon the earth. So again, here we have the origin of the voice given, but not necessarily an identity. What do you think would be the identity of this voice? Okay, David says God. Any reason why?
Through the angels, that's what we see back in the Old Testament. God speaking out of the tabernacle.
Okay, so the origin of the voice is important, and it might clue us into the identity, maybe a divine authority speaking from that place. So typically God dwells in the temple or the tabernacle, at least that's our human perception of where God is. And so that may indicate here that the voice that is telling these angels to go forth is divinity. Note that the bowls are poured out upon the earth, but only the wicked here are affected. Is that significant? Why is that?
Because he protects those that are his followers.
Absolutely. So, what's that?
Keeps them safe.
Yeah, absolutely. In Psalm 37, the psalmist there tells us in the very beginning, fret not thyself because of evildoers, right? Don't be concerned about the wicked and those kinds of things. God will take care of you. Later on in that psalm, he says, for I am young and now I am old, yet have I not seen the righteous forsaken, nor his seed begging bread. We move into the New Testament text and we look at the Hebrews writer, and there the Hebrews writer tells us, for he hath said, I will never leave you nor forsake you. So God's view or disposition toward his people is one of care and protection, while at the same time judgment befalls those who are antagonistic or in opposition to him. Where do we see this fulfilled, or at least in a very forward way in the Old Testament? I'm not necessarily referring to Malachi chapter 3, although that is one point, but in the book of Genesis, we find this in its fulfillment in the way God cares for folks. Anybody might recall an incident with Abraham where God is dealing with this very thing? What about the judgment against the cities of the plain? Sodom and Gomorrah. What did Abraham do? Did he say, all right, God, go smoke them? Get rid of them all? Sounds good? No. Why was Abraham concerned about the cities? Because Lot was there, his family, but by virtue of being his family, also someone who followed who? God. He was righteous. And so what is Abraham's response to God? Far be it from thee, Lord, to destroy the righteous with the wicked. Far be it from thee. Shall not the judge of all the earth do what? Do right. So in this judgment that is poured out upon the whole earth, God's people are protected in his care. Now the first went and poured out his vial upon the earth, and there fell a noisome and grievous sore upon the men which had the mark of the beast, and upon them which worshipped his image. So the first vial, as it's poured out, affects who directly?
Serve the beast, the devil, with the mark upon
Okay.
their forehead, their hand, wherever.
So were these God's people or... But here's the key. Is it on nature or is it on humanity? Humanity. How is this different than other plagues that have been poured out up to this point?
Well, the Bible said it always said a third of the earth, so you could assume that also would have included possibly the Christians Well, it's almost like a division between the first 3 plagues on Egypt, and then afterwards, at the third plague, you've got only Egypt suffered. The Israelite nation did not suffer from those plagues.
Okay. Yes and no. I mean, that is true, but what's the difference between those plagues and this here? What's the object of the judgment? Who are these plagues being poured out on? The wicked, but people, right? So before you have a progressive element of the judgment. First it's the water, then it's the livestock, then it's the grasshoppers and the frogs and all that kind of stuff. And only after a while, when men have been given a space to repent, does the plague fall upon men directly. Now, men are indirectly affected by the plagues, okay, but here we have the first plague that is poured out go straight to the individuals themselves, okay, and not necessarily nature. Now, there is a shift in the prepositions, by the way, of these first 3 and the last 4, from epi to ace, or from ace into epi, but it's really has no bearing, no real significance there. Notice in the very first bowl that man is struck with judgment over and against the 6th Egyptian plague and the 5th trumpet. So we go back to the trumpets, and it's not until the 5th trumpet is sounded that men are directly affected. We go back to the Egyptian plagues in Exodus, and it's not until the 6th plague that men are affected directly by what is going on. Now, here is different. What does that tell us about the judgment of God here in this one? Yeah, he's not messing around. There's no delay. Judgment is immediate and prompt and going straight towards those people who stand in opposition to him. By the way, if you have a different term than noisome, which is a King Jamesism, it's translated from a word that means bad. So when we look at these boils, this bad and grievous sore that falls upon the men is also used in Luke 16 and 21, which would be these abscesses or ulcers. So this is the only other time in the New Testament when this word is used, but it's used to refer to an abscess or a boil or an ulcer, something that is and does affect the body. Now, if you think about what's in an abscess, it makes sense. What is all that? Now, I won't get all medical and wax gross on you, I promise. But there's lots of nasty stuff in ulcers and in boils and abscesses. What's going on and what is within the people who are following the adversary, who are following this emperor worship? Sin. And what does sin do? Sin causes separation through death, right? And so death leads to what kind of state? After the body dies, what happens to the body? It rots. So you get this idea of putrefaction here. So here, in this particular instance, you're looking at all of the vile stuff from these people coming out in their person, and them pretty much rotting as they are alive. So it's a pretty graphic image, but it's all of those people who followed after the beast and had the mark of the beast and worshipped his image. Notice that this is also against the Roman system of emperor worship. You and I have already talked about how emperor worship functioned. We've talked about the fact that it was pressed upon the citizens of Rome to do this, and those who were Christians refused to, and so as a result were martyred. We saw the martyrs under the throne in Revelation 6. But now what seems to be the case is God is exacting his judgment against those who had martyred his saints and persecuted his people. So now we have almost in response God's answer to the martyrs' prayers. How long, O Lord, right? And that question that goes up to God, who are under that altar of incense, how long before you execute judgment and justice against these people? And that's always, by the way, been the cry of God's people when undergoing persecution, when undergoing great trial or despair. The question is, how long? When are you going to avenge us when are you going to vindicate our response to you over and against the judgment of the wicked? And isn't that maybe the question that a lot of people who follow God even today ask? Will we be vindicated in our pursuit of righteous living and conduct? The answer is yes. And here we have the judgment of God against the Roman system of emperor worship. The second angel poured out his vial upon the sea, and it became as the blood of a dead man, and every living soul died in the sea. Now, interesting, there's a few things going on in the text. The word "it became" is, well, we'll talk about that when we get there. But now we have the blood of a dead man. That is, every living soul in the sea died. So what's different about this than the trumpets? It's already been mentioned, but just to... So how much was consumed in the sea in the earlier judgment? A third. Yep, that's exactly right. So now, how many and how much? All. Every living soul, okay, died in the sea. What is the sea a reference to, by the way, that we've talked about many times? What's that?
The sea of humanity.
Humanity, yeah, that's right. So if you go to a crowd, right, we use oftentimes in a metaphoric way, that is a what of people? A sea of people. Again, that's how it's being used here. The sea of people, right, this would be society. And all of those who are worshiping and following the emperor are dying. So in the second trumpet, a third of the sea becomes blood and a third of the creatures die. Here, the whole sea and all creatures are affected by the bowl that's poured out. Okay, so all of those that are following the emperor, that are worshiping the beast, that are adhering to the false prophet, they're the ones who are being punished. In 13:1, the sea was society, so here too may also be society that is affected. Okay, now we will be affected by the ups and downs, right, of life. The rise and fall of nations will affect all humanity. But what is different here with God's people? Well, God's people are still under his care and protection. Now, it's interesting here, it became as the blood of a dead man. This bowl might narrow the focus of the rot of this dead society, as we talked about those ulcers and those abscesses. Now we're looking at society, Roman society, wholly dead, that is, not being able to give life in any meaningful way. Now, when the Republic of Rome was set up, there were a lot of good laws that were in place and a lot of moral laws. And by the way, they had a very high regard for marriage and for the marital relationship and those kinds of things. But at this point, in the imperial Rome, you have a completely different perspective on morality. I mean, how much does 700 years change? Well, I might even ask this, how much does 250 years change? A lot. So now we're looking at the glut of Rome and the rot of her society. Now, when it says it became, it might read there occurred as the blood of a dead man. And that's important. It may not seem significant to you, but what it might be indicating here is rather than it becoming, there is the occurrence of the blood leaking out of the bodies that are dead and decaying, but that blood is now rotting. Okay, in Leviticus 17:11, there the text says, "The life of the flesh is in the blood, and I've given it to you upon the altar to make atonement for your soul, for it is the blood that makes an atonement for the soul." If the life of the flesh is in the blood, okay, as it is in the body, now it's being pulled out of the body. What does that say about those individuals? They're dead. Can you live without blood? Anybody in here tried it? No? Okay. No, you cannot live without blood. You have to have blood in the body because it's that which transports nutrients and oxygen to all of the organs of the body. Okay? So, it's very clear the life of the flesh is in the blood. Here, the blood coming out of the sea, right, or turning into blood, is the idea of them losing their lives in a very metaphorical way. Now, I do want to say with verses 1 through 9, or really this whole chapter, it's hard to be dogmatic about any one reading or view because there are many different ways to understand this. So just as you're reading through, I like Occam's razor. The simplest explanation is probably the most right. And so when we look at the biblical text about what it says about these things, and then look at maybe some apocalyptic works and see how this chapter squares with those, I think we can come away with at least an idea. Now, we may not be dead on sometimes, but just keep in the back of your mind that these are sometimes guesstimates about what we're referring to as well. And the third angel poured out his vial upon the rivers and fountains of waters, and they became blood. So in the earlier judgment, only a third was affected. Here, all the water is turned to blood. In Exodus 7 and verse 20, the people could find groundwater to drink, but in this plague, all becomes blood. So, in this judgment, what did God do? Well, he closed that loophole. All right, so now everything is becoming blood. There is no way for people to have something to drink. Now, why would that matter? Can you live without water? No. But is water, and does water have any special, I guess, metaphoric value when we look at the biblical text? Do we see water anywhere else?
The water, you get the washing. Go back and look at the high priest on the Day of Atonement. He bathes himself, signifying the cleaning of himself before he goes toward God. You think about Christian today, you think about baptism. That washes away our sins. And it's in that water that we come in contact with the blood of Christ.
Okay.
And so water is important all the way through. When you think about, like I said, back in the Old Testament, the washings before they put on their garbs. Us today, being washed in the blood of Christ in baptism.
Okay, absolutely. So all of those things definitely find merit there. Immersion is certainly important. The washing of the priests as they go into the tabernacle, into their service. Is anybody important to talk about water? What about, well, it's not in this. Well, I was going to go to John 4. It might be in a little bit.
You're talking about Jesus talking to the Samaritan woman.
Yeah, in John chapter 4, Jesus says what about himself? If you drink from this water, you're going to what again? Yeah, but if you drink from the fountains of living waters, you shall never thirst again. So again, righteousness is depicted as living water. Death is depicted here as blood, those things that do not cause one to survive. And I think I've got that, might have that in a different slide. Yeah, here it is. I heard the angel of the waters say. It's interesting, we've not seen any angel depicted this way, but what appears to be the case is that each element has its own angel, the fire, the earth, the water, and the air. He says, say, thou art righteous, O Lord, which art and wast and shalt be, because you have judged thus, or in this way. For they have shed the blood of saints and prophets, and thou hast given them blood to drink, for they are worthy. Now, whenever we hear that statement, for they are worthy, what is that usually couched in? Right, in a positive or negative way?
In a negative way.
Whenever we hear they're worthy? Nevertheless, thou hast a few saints, even in Sardis, which have not defiled their garments, and they shall walk with me in white, for what? For they are worthy. So worthy is typically a positive connotation, right? Worthy is typically a positive connotation, and now here we have those wicked being worthy of death. Now we do see this elsewhere in the letters of Paul, okay, when he talks about those that are worthy of death, not only do the same, but have pleasure in them to do them. That's Romans chapter 1. But most of the time when we think of someone being worthy, that is a positive connotation. So now look here, the angel of the waters, each element has its angel, and each angel has its work to accomplish. This angel proclaims the rightness of this judgment, or the righteousness of God, rather, here in this case. And there is a commensurate judgment from God for those who are practicing wicked things. So when we look at what's going on here, we're looking at God executing judgment against those who need that judgment poured out on them. What did the vile city do to the prophets that were sent, the two prophets? Anybody remember? Killed the prophets, right? Their bodies were dead and laid in the street 3 days, and the people rejoiced, and then they were resurrected and caught away. Now, what is the judgment against that city? He says they shall drink their blood. Now, here, what is going on? Now they're getting their fill of that blood, okay? He who sheddeth man's blood shall by man's blood, or by man's hand, his blood be shed, okay? Which is a statement in Deuteronomy and in Numbers about those who commit murder. Again, those who executed the prophets are now going to succumb to God's judgment for their wicked conduct. They are certainly worthy of receiving that punishment. He says, I heard the angel of the waters say, thou art righteous. We talked about that. In Obadiah 1 and verse 15 and 16, we get an Old Testament reference concerning this very thing. He says, for the day of the Lord is near upon all the heathen, that would be all the Gentiles. As you have done, it shall be done unto thee. Thy reward shall return upon thine own head, for as you have drunk upon my holy mountain, so shall all the heathen drink continually. Yes, they shall drink, and they shall swallow down, and they shall be as though they had not been. What is he talking about drinking here? What is God's anger referred to as? Yeah, his anger and wrath is referred to as his cup, right? The cup of the fierceness of his anger, of his wrath. Now, we've already talked about the fact here that in the end of chapter 14, they're going to drink of the wrath of God. Now, guess what? That's not a new trope. That's something that we've seen in the prophets multiple times, and here in Obadiah as well. By the way, Obadiah is only one chapter. I would encourage you to read it, but not during my sermon this morning. It's great to see what God does there. He says, I heard another out of the altar say, even so, Lord God Almighty, true and righteous are thy judgments. So now this voice proclaims the righteousness of God's judgment. Genesis 18:25, Abraham, in arguing with God there about the cities of the plain, makes this statement, shall not the judge of all the earth do right? Rhetorically, the answer is yes, God will do what is right. And now what we have being echoed here in the Revelation letter, God's judgments are right. In fact, the psalmist says, true and righteous are they all together, right? The law of the Lord, God's judgments or dictums toward how men are to behave. And then God's pronouncements of his edicts against mankind are also just. It appears that the martyrs and the saints here are being vindicated for their maltreatment, and the Lord is answering their prayers. We know we've heard those prayers before. Also, when we talk about this, note the allegory of the waters. This is where we were talking about that. John 4 and verse 14, we see the statement there to the woman at the well of Samaria. Jesus is the fountain of living waters, okay? And so if you drink from that fountain, the fountain of righteousness, you will live. Isaiah 12 and verse 3, we have a sentiment regarding those waters, but Jeremiah 2 and verse 13, there they've forsaken the fountain of living waters and have hewed them out cisterns, broken cisterns which can hold no water. So again, we get the idea that water is a very important element here for not only life, but also, if it's turned into blood, those individuals are going to die. The fourth angel poured out his vial upon the sun, and power was given unto him to scorch men with fire. So the fourth trumpet caused the sun, moon, and stars not to shine. Right? Very different than what we see here, isn't it? And in the plagues in Exodus, what happens? Anybody recall?
I'm drawing a blank because I know in Numbers 11.
Darkness over all the land for how many days? 3 days, right? So there's darkness over all the land. So the sun did not shine during that time. Now the sun is really shining. God's turned up the dial. The ninth plague in Egypt caused a 3-day darkness. Here, this plague turns the sun into a weapon against humanity. Is sunlight good? What does it do? What's that? Gives us vitamin D. Absolutely. So photosynthesis, right, occurs with sunlight. So sunlight brings life. Okay? Light brings life. This is very consistent with the depictions of divinity. God is light, in him is no darkness. Right? God is life. That life was the light of men, John chapter 1. So again, we see the synonyms of light with darkness. Now, what does light do to bad things? I heard exposes them. Okay, absolutely. What does sunlight do to bad things? Well, it can kill it, right? So we talk about germs, viruses, that kind of stuff. Sunlight, UV rays can kill them. Why do wicked people want to hide from light? Exposes their shame. It shows who they really are. What does God tell us? For all things are open, right? With the eyes, or in the eyes of him with whom we have to do. Right? There's nothing that is hid from him. So when we look at what's going on here, you have a couple of things going on. The light is scorching them, is burning them. Okay, they're not of the light, they're of the darkness. And now this light is being shined onto them, and it's turned into a weapon against those that are doing wrong. This is not new. We see God using this kind of judgment. The psalmist writer says in Psalm 97:3, a fire goes before him and burns up his enemies round about. Psalm 104:4, who makes his angel spirits, his ministers, a flaming fire. God is used to using fire in judgment. He also uses it in warning as well. So in Genesis, when God blocks the way to the Garden of Eden, what does he set before it at the gate or the entrance? A flaming sword, right? So we have God utilizing fire in that warning way. Isaiah 47:13 and 14, there it says, thou art wearied in the multitude of thy counsels. Let now the astrologers, the stargazers, the monthly prognosticators stand up and save thee from these things that shall come upon thee. Behold, they shall be as stubble. The fire shall burn them. They shall not deliver themselves from the power of the flame. There shall not be a coal to warm at, nor fire to sit before it. What is he saying here? It's interesting, the things that these people are worshiping now become their downfall, right? They're worshiping the sun and the moon and the stars, and now it's the sun that is causing them to be burned up. So you have this flip, right? God showing his control over these astrological elements or signs, and he says there shall not be a coal to warm at, nor fire to sit before it. Everything is going to be consuming, not something that you sit and warm your hands by. Okay? And now we have, and men were scorched with great heat, and blasphemed the name of God, who has power over these plagues, and they repented not to give him glory. So those that are now being judged refuse to repent, and then on top of that, they blaspheme the name of God. Why in the world would someone think it a right practice to curse the one that is punishing them? Especially if it's divine. That doesn't happen today, does it? It does all the time. Absolutely it does. How many people do you know who stand in defiance against God? Not only are they, I would argue that they're believers in the sense that they're more fierce in their repudiation of God than are individuals who are faithful in their desire or determination to serve him. It's fascinating that you have to be a believer in order to defy God. But again, that makes no sense, because if you believe in his person, why would you defy him? Well, because people want to do what they want to do. Romans 1 and verse 21, because that when they knew God, they glorified him not as God, neither were thankful, but became vain in their imaginations, and their foolish heart was darkened. Okay, there he continues, professing themselves to be wise, they became fools, and changed the glory of the incorruptible God into things that are corruptible. So here we look at them turning into idolatry. Well, what is the Roman system of religion? pure idolatry and emperor worship. So Romans 2, 4 through 11 and 11:22 are important here. He says, "Or despisest thou the riches of his goodness and forbearance and long suffering? God is patient." But here, why is everyone being consumed? In chapter 16, why is the whole earth being affected by this? Oh, just getting to the really good parts. Well, we will pick up here next week and move forward into the rest of chapter 16. I want to encourage you to jump ahead, read ahead, and dig a little bit deeper into the text so that we'll have some good discussion next Sunday morning. I appreciate your attention.